Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Los Angeles wakes slowly, like a giant stretching beneath a blanket of pale morning light. The sun has not yet claimed the sky, but its first hints are already touching the horizon, softening the edges of the city. The palm trees stand tall and still, their silhouettes etched against a lavender dawn. Cars move in silence, as if unsure whether morning has truly begun. And for a brief moment, the entire landscape feels suspended, caught between the last breath of night and the promise of a new day. There is a peace here, delicate and unhurried. It drapes itself over the cracked sidewalks, the empty basketball courts, the corner stores with metal shutters still pulled tight. It settles in the quiet neighborhoods where families are only beginning to stir, unaware that the world they know is inching toward a storm they cannot yet imagine. There is no warning siren, no flicker on the skyline that hints at what is coming. Only the soft hum of the city waking up, innocent and untroubled dot in the distance. The skyline glows faintly, an outline of towers that seem to rise from a haze. The air carries the faint scent of asphalt warming under the early light, mixed with the cool reminder of the ocean not far beyond. It is a city built on contrasts, glamour and hardship, hope and hunger, dreams and their slow unraveling. But in this particular moment, everything is quiet. Everything is still. And somewhere within this vast, unfolding landscape is a young boy who has not yet learned how drastically his life will collide with the very bones of this city. Rick Ross begins his story not in the glare of notoriety, but in the soft shadows of childhood. He grows up in a world where opportunities are fragile things, easily broken, easily lost. Poverty sits quietly in the corners of his home, never loud, never dramatic, simply present, like an unwelcome guest that refuses to leave. His neighborhood is a place where ambition must fight for air, where survival often overshadows dreams, and where the weight of limitation presses on children long before they understand its name. But Rick is different. Even as a boy, he carries a certain stillness, a thoughtful way of observing the world around him. He sees possibility where others see dead ends. He sees paths where others see walls. His mother works tirelessly, doing what she can to keep a sense of dignity in a life that rarely offers it freely. And Rick watches her, how she moves through hardship with quiet determination, and he absorbs that strength like a language. For a while, his dream is simple and pure. Tennis. A sport not often associated with boys from his part of Los Angeles, yet something about it calls to him. He loves the rhythm of it, the bounce, the swing, the clean snap of the ball meeting the center of the racket. On the courts, he feels something he rarely feels anywhere else: clarity. He feels competent, focused, alive. The world narrows into a white line and a net, and for a moment, everything makes sense. Coaches notice him. They see his discipline, his natural instinct, his hunger to learn. They see a kid who arrives early, leaves late, and treats the game with respect. And there's a small but powerful hope blooming inside him that maybe this could be his way out. Maybe tennis could carry him into a different life. One where the horizon is wider, where the choices are many, where the weight pressing on his shoulders feels just a little lighter. But the universe has its own way of drawing borders around certain lives. The truth arrives quietly, almost gently, as if trying not to wound him too deeply. Rick discovers that he cannot advance academically because he cannot read well enough. Not well enough to pass. Not well enough to move forward. Not well enough to keep the dream from slipping through his fingers. There's no dramatic collapse, no outburst, no breaking point. Just a slow, silent disintegration of possibility. A door closing without making a sound. He is old enough to understand what it means, but young enough to wish he didn't. The shame settles inside him. Not sharp but dull like a stone he must learn to carry. The dream doesn't shatter all at once. It fades. The meetings with coaches become less frequent. The conversations about scholarships fall away. The future he imagined becomes distant, like something glimpsed through fog. And the city, always indifferent, continues to move around him, unaware of the quiet battle playing out in the mind. Heart of a boy who no longer knows where he belongs. But every story of transformation begins here in the space where dreams falter and identity searches for a new shape. Rick stands at that threshold, unaware that the path waiting for him will not resemble the one he once hoped for. It will be darker, faster, more dangerous. It will lead him into places he never expected to go, shaping him into someone he never thought he would become. As night falls over Los Angeles, the air cools and the city lights flicker awake. The freeways glow with streaks of red and white, as if the city itself is breathing in long, luminous waves. On a pedestrian overpass above one of these endless rivers of traffic, Rick stands quietly, watching the lights blur beneath him. The wind brushes past, carrying the scent of exhaust and warm concrete. He doesn't know it yet. But these streets, the ones stretching beneath his feet, winding through South Central, cutting across neighborhoods divided by invisible lines, will one day carry his name. They will shape his legend, his downfall, his legacy. They will echo with the consequences of choices he has not yet made. For now, he is only a boy standing above a city that sleeps with open eyes. A boy searching for a place to belong. A boy unaware that the storm is already gathering behind him. Silent and unstoppable. And the city, still unaware, prepares for a dawn unlike any it has ever seen. There are moments in a life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, like a change in the air, a shifted glance, a conversation that seems ordinary at first, but leaves a mark that grows over time. For Rick Ross, the moment his path began to bend did not come with drama or noise. It came with a simple introduction, one man stepping out of the dim edges of his world and showing him a different kind of possibility. The man was older, confident in a way that didn't require effort. He carried himself the way people do when they understand how power moves through a room. He didn't need to speak loudly. His clothes, his car, his manner did most of the talking. To a young Rick, fresh from the quiet disappointment of lost dreams, this older man seemed almost unreal. A figure shaped by choices that the world had never offered him. Rick watched him carefully at first, drawn not by the glamour, but by the subtlety behind it. There was a calmness to the man, a sense of control that came from knowing he possessed something others needed. People leaned toward him when he spoke. They softened, their voices lowered, as if his presence taught them a new kind of respect. Rick had rarely seen that kind of influence. It stirred something inside him, something that had been restless since tennis slipped away. Something that wanted to matter in a world that had already tried to tell him his place. The mentor did not rush to reveal his world. Instead, he allowed Rick to observe it slowly, piece by piece. A conversation here, a ride across town there, a glimpse into the mechanics of desire. Rick learned first with his eyes, studying how the older man listened more than he spoke, how he watched people as if every gesture were a coded message. He noticed how need changed the rhythm of conversations, how desperation made people fold in on themselves, how money, paper, and ink could shift the temperature of a room with astonishing ease. And then, one evening, the man placed something small and carefully wrapped on the table between them. Cocaine. But in this moment, it was not a drug, not even a danger. It was a symbol, sharp, glittering, and strangely quiet. It was a door, half open, offering a narrow strip of light. To Rick, it held the shimmer of escape, the suggestion of a world where the limitations that had shaped his childhood might loosen their grip. The mentor didn't pressure him. He didn't romanticize it. He simply explained the reality, the demand, the money, the discipline it required. He spoke about risk as though it were a currency of its own, something you learn to manage rather than fear. He talked about the streets like a living organism, one that rewarded those who understood its psychology and punished those who didn't. Rick listened. He absorbed each word with the same focus he once brought to a tennis court. He felt the familiar spark of possibility lighting up inside him again. He didn't see a future yet, not clearly. He only felt the pull, the chance to breathe, to rise, to build something in a world that had offered him so few doors to walk through. The early deals were small. They took place in dim, cramped rooms where curtains stayed closed even during daylight. The air always felt heavy, as though the walls themselves held secrets. The conversations were whispered, cautious. Every sound seemed amplified, the click of a lighter, the rustle of bills, the muted scrape of a chair across the floor. There was no glamour here, no thrill. Only a sense of stillness, of something fragile and dangerous unfolding in slow motion. Rick did not rush. He learned. He paid attention to the details most people ignored. The hesitation in someone's voice, the slight tremor in a hand, the way a person's eyes shifted when they were lying. He began to understand that the product mattered less than the people. Their wants, their fears, their illusions. He studied the streets the way others studied textbooks, with a quiet determination that came from knowing this might be his only chance to change the direction of his life. Money began to flow toward him, not a flood, but a steady stream. Enough to change the way he walked through his neighborhood. Enough to silence the doubts that had grown loud inside him ever since school closed its doors. Enough to remind him that he was capable, disciplined, strategic. Unlike the tennis courts, this world didn't measure him by grades or reading levels. It measured him by nerve, by intuition, by the way he navigated the unspoken rules of an underground economy. Hope, subtle and cautious, crept back into him. But it arrived hand in hand with danger. Rick could feel it, like a shadow trailing his every step. The streets had a rhythm, but they also had a memory. They noticed weakness. They punished mistakes without hesitation. For every gain he made, there was an echo of something unseen, watching, waiting. He didn't know it yet, but the path he was stepping onto would expand faster than he could imagine. Swallowing years, friendships, innocence, still. He kept going, because for the first time since tennis slipped away from him, he felt movement. He felt potential. He felt that the world might finally offer him a place where his ambition could stretch without being held down by the boundaries of poverty and forgotten schools. Late one night, after a series of small transactions that felt larger than they were, Rick found himself walking alone under a cold slice of moonlight. The street was nearly empty, the air sharp against his skin. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of bills, not large, not monumental, but heavier than anything he had ever held. He stepped beneath a flickering streetlight, its glow stuttering like an unsteady breath. The bills looked different in that trembling light, almost unreal, almost symbolic. The wind brushed across his hands, cool and questioning, as though the night itself were pausing to ask him whether he understood the price of the path he had chosen. Rick stood there for a long moment, silent, his breath rising in faint clouds. He didn't know the cost yet. Not fully. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. A door had opened, and he had stepped through it. The rise of Rick Ross did not begin with noise. It did not begin with shouting crowds, flashing lights, or any announcement that a new presence was forming in South Central Los Angeles. It began with a quiet accumulation of habits, small routines, careful choices, and the subtle ways in which a young man learned to navigate a world that was shifting beneath his feet. He moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though he were trying not to disturb the thin surface of calm stretched across his life. He carried himself with the humility of someone who had known disappointment too intimately to ever become arrogant. Where others barked orders or flaunted whatever status they managed to gather, Rick stayed in the background. He listened. He observed. He allowed the streets to speak first, and in return, the streets began to recognize him long before he recognized himself. His business grew the way vines crawl steadily, quietly, always reaching for new ground. Returning customers brought friends. Friends brought whispers. Whispers drifted between neighborhoods, across fences, through dim hallways of apartment buildings that seemed frozen in time. And somewhere in those murmured exchanges, the name Rick began to travel. No titles, no legend. Just his name, spoken with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Rick didn't chase the growth. It simply formed around him. A few trusted friends gravitated toward him, people who admired his patience, his calm, his ability to think clearly even when others panicked. He never acted like a leader, but his steadiness naturally placed him at the center. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't boast. He didn't try to impress anyone. And yet, people found themselves moving in rhythm with him, as though he were setting the tempo of something larger. There was something disarming about his gentleness. Not softness, but composure and unshakable stillness that made those around him feel safer than they had any reason to feel. Rick had learned early that visibility came with danger. So he mastered the art of being present without being loud, influential without being flamboyant. He blended into the background like a shadow that happened to know exactly where to stand. As the weeks slipped into months, a subtle shift began to ripple through certain corners of South Central. Abandoned apartments took on new life after dark. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter grew quieter, their energy changing in small, almost imperceptible ways. Conversations became more private. Eyes became more watchful. There was a restlessness in the air, an uneasiness carried on the wind, hinting at something forming just beyond the edge of awareness. Crack cocaine was not yet a plague, not yet a headline, not yet the devastation it would become. It entered the city like a soft drifting fog unnoticed until it was too late. Rick did not invent it. He did not seek it. But he became part of its earliest chapters, drawn in by opportunity, pulled forward by the momentum of a drug that would reshape entire communities. The rooms where these early transactions took place were dim, thick with the lingering scent of hurried decisions. Rick noticed how the atmosphere seemed to shift as crack slowly replaced powder, how customers arrived with a different kind of urgency, how their voices carried a sharper edge, how desperation clung to them like an invisible film. It was a transformation that unfolded quietly, a change in mood rather than spectacle. But Rick remained steady. He treated every interaction with meticulous care, always respectful, always composed. His customers trusted him because he never tried to take more than he needed. He didn't cheat. He didn't bully. He didn't threaten. There was no need. His reliability was his power, and the streets appreciated the rarity of it. The money increased, but Rick stayed grounded. He still wore simple clothes. He still walked the same streets. He still spoke softly. If anything, the rise made him even more careful. He understood that success had a shadow, and he could feel it trailing him more clearly now. But ambition is a quiet force, and his had found room to breathe at last. The transformation of his life was not sudden. It was gradual, like the slow brightening of a horizon before sunrise. The people around him noticed it first, how he became the one they sought for decisions, how others stepped aside instinctively when he entered a room, how his calm steadiness seemed to anchor even the most chaotic moments. He didn't ask for the responsibility. But the streets chose him. South Central, however, was changing in ways neither he nor anyone else could foresee. The introduction of crack was darkening the atmosphere of entire blocks. The laughter on front porches began to thin out. The music that once echoed in alleyways grew warped by new tensions. Families sensed something was different, though many couldn't name it yet. An uneasiness pulsed through the neighborhoods, subtle but unmistakable. Rick felt it too. In the quiet moments, when he walked alone beneath the dull glow of streetlights, he sensed the weight of unseen forces beginning to press inward. But he continued building because the path felt inevitable now, as though the choices he made were not entirely his own, but shaped by the momentum of a city moving through a dangerous evolution. His influence spread, not through fear, but through consistency. He created a structure almost without meaning to, a network of helpers, watchers, runners, and trusted confidants. Not an empire, not yet, but the early bones of one. A skeleton taking shape beneath the surface. People began referring to the route he managed as a freeway, not because of any official name, but because the movement around him felt fast, smooth, and surprisingly organized. And in time, Rick himself would inherit the nickname Freeway Rick, though at this early stage, he did not fully grasp the scale of what he was becoming. One evening, as he walked through a neighborhood he had known since childhood, he noticed something unsettling. Faces he didn't recognize. Cars parked where they never used to be. People watching him too closely or not at all. It wasn't anything overt, just a movement beneath the surface like water shifting before a storm. He paused under the glow of a street lamp, letting the familiar night wrap around him. The air felt different, thicker, charged. Success was opening doors for him, but it was also opening doors for others' competitors. Strangers, forces he couldn't yet name, and for the first time, Rick sensed that the world he was shaping was beginning to shape itself around him, in ways he could no longer fully control. Growth has a sound to it. Not a loud one, not the kind that draws eyes or stirs alarm, but a low and steady hum, like a city breathing deeper with each passing night. Rick Ross began to feel that hum under his feet long before anyone spoke of empires or legends. It moved through South Central in quiet currents, threading itself through alleyways, abandoned storefronts, and the long, restless streets that stretched beneath the endless California sky. What began as a cautious rise now unfolded with a sense of direction, a clarity Rick didn't fully recognize as leadership. He didn't wake one morning and decide to build something vast. Instead, structure emerged around him the way shadows lengthen as the sun dips west naturally. Inevitably, without ceremony, Rick organized his world with the precision of someone who had always been underestimated. He understood logistics instinctively, when to move, when to wait, where to store product, how to build trust with people whose loyalty lived in the fragile space between fear and hope. But Rick didn't rely on intimidation. His authority came from a steadiness that others found rare. He remembered names. He honored his word. He kept operations clean, organized, predictable. Those around him felt that, and they followed him because calm leaders are hard to find in chaotic places. Under his direction, the network widened. One neighborhood became two. Two became five. Soon, the quiet system he had built wound itself into corners of the city he barely visited. Runners, suppliers, watchers, drivers, they all found purpose in the rhythm Rick created. And he kept the rhythm simple. He didn't micromanage. He delegated. He listened. He corrected mistakes gently but firmly. The empire grew not through force, but through the quiet competence of a man who understood how to turn disorder into something that resembled balance. Los Angeles, meanwhile, was transforming. The freeways hummed like arteries, carrying restless energy across the sprawling landscape. Streetlights flickered over neighborhoods caught in the strange tension of change, too subtle to name, too heavy to ignore. Families felt it, They heard whispers of new movements shaping the night. A new economy had begun to pulse beneath the surface, bringing opportunity to some and devastation to others. Rick moved through the shifting world with cautious discipline. He had watched what happened to men who rose too quickly, too loudly. They burned out, swallowed either by greed or by the hungry eyes of law enforcement. Rick avoided both. He refused to flash money. He avoided the clubs, the parties, the temptation to become a character in his own story. He preferred the background, the quiet roots, the comfort of blending into the city he knew so well. He believed discipline would keep him safe. That if he stayed humble, stayed organized, stayed invisible, he could outrun the dangers that clung to the shadows of the world he'd chosen. It was a belief rooted not in arrogance, but in logic. Rick studied risk the same way he had studied tennis when he was young, analytically, patiently, with an eye for patterns others missed. But with success came gravity. People began to depend on him in ways he never anticipated. The neighborhoods that had once ignored him now turned toward him with open palms, drawn by the intoxicating mix of necessity and hope. Some saw him as an opportunity. Others saw him as a savior. A few whispered his name as though it belonged to someone larger than life. Myth works quietly. It attaches itself to a person without asking permission. Rick felt its weight before he ever saw its shape. More suppliers approached him. More runners volunteered. More connections formed. And soon Rick realized he was no longer the quiet young man navigating shadows, but the center of a widening web, one that stretched farther than he could easily monitor. The product moved with unprecedented speed. Transactions multiplied, repeating themselves in countless small spaces. Kitchens lit only by refrigerator bulbs. Cars idling under freeway pillars. Stairwells where whispered agreements passed from hand to hand. Rick's influence threaded itself into the architecture of the night, yet he remained cautious, almost ascetic. He refused to carry weapons. He discouraged violence. He insisted on clarity, communication, and order. And for a time, this discipline kept the empire running smoothly, as though he had imposed a strange tranquility on a world known for its volatility. But tranquility has limits. The more the network expanded, the more its edges frayed. Rick began to sense it during the long drives across the city, when he watched unfamiliar figures lingering in neighborhoods he once knew intimately. He sensed it in the restless eyes of new associates, people drawn not by loyalty, but by the smell of money. He sensed it in the rising tension of communities trying to understand why their nights felt heavier than they used to. He told himself he could manage it, that his structure was strong enough to hold the weight of its own momentum. But a quiet unease settled in him, a recognition that the empire no longer moved at the pace he set. It had begun to generate its own rhythm, independent of his careful guidance. Success, he realized, was no longer a path. It was a tide, and tides do not stop for anyone. One evening, he visited a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place used for storage. Inventory, the cold arithmetic of the business he had built. The building was stark silent, illuminated only by a few weak lights suspended from steel beams. Dust hovered in the air like suspended breath. Rick walked between rows of stacked boxes, each one representing choices he had made, opportunities he had taken, the future he had unknowingly constructed around himself. There was order here at least, a sense of structure that had always given him comfort. But tonight, the warehouse felt different. It felt larger, emptier, as though the quiet was trying to speak to him. He paused in the center of the space, letting the stillness settle against him. Through the thin walls, he could hear the distant roar of the freeway, a constant, restless pulse that echoed through the city. Night after night. It sounded almost like a warning. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, and the hum of Los Angeles washed over him. The empire he had built was growing faster than he could hold it. He sensed that the path ahead would not be shaped by discipline alone. And standing in that cavernous warehouse, listening to the soft thunder of traffic rolling endlessly through the darkness. Rick understood that expansion always carries a cost. Cost he could feel approaching. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. Success is a quiet disruptor. It does not announce its arrival with a bang, nor does it unfold in dramatic gestures. Instead, it seeps in, reshaping the air, bending the behaviors of those around you, and altering the rhythm of life so subtly that you scarcely notice until the change has settled deep within your world. For Rick Ross, this was the beginning of an awareness that his empire once, a space of controlled growth and disciplined, ambition had begun to evolve without him. Like water spilling over the edges of a carefully built vessel. At first, it was almost imperceptible. He noticed how people spoke differently in rooms he had once entered without ceremony. Friends who had once greeted him casually now carried themselves with a slight deference, a subtle caution, as though interacting with him required an unspoken protocol. Conversations shifted. Laughter carried a tinge of calculation. The energy of familiar spaces seemed altered, reshaped by the presence of wealth, influence, and expectation. The rooms themselves, once neutral containers of ordinary life, now felt charged, almost sentient, humming with an unspoken tension. Rick observed all of this with a patience honed from years of quiet vigilance. He had built his world on discipline, on attentiveness, on knowing when to speak and when to remain still. Now the same attentiveness revealed its limits. The relationships he once trusted, the casual alliances, the friendships that had been equal, were beginning to stretch under the weight of new roles and unspoken hierarchies. Friends became employees. Employees became liabilities. And everyone, whether knowingly or not, began orbiting him in ways he could not entirely control. Even the gatherings themselves became exercises in subtle anxiety. Parties that once felt alive now carried undertones of observation and scrutiny. Rick stood at the periphery, noticing how laughter could conceal envy, how compliments could mask calculation. He watched interactions unfold like complex machinery, the gears turning silently, yet unmistakably, behind the smiling faces of his peers. Money, influence, and the sheer momentum of his operation had begun to distort the very people he once understood. He felt the duality pressing against him. A quiet boy from South Central still existed inside him. Grounded, observant, cautious. But there was also the myth, the version of himself that had taken shape across the city, whispered about in hallways, recognized in storefronts, and felt in the tension of streets after dark. The coexistence was not seamless. Each identity required different instincts, different responses, different compromises. And the lines between them blurred with every decision, every handshake, every subtle negotiation in rooms charged with expectation. Rick's internal world mirrored the external one. Every step forward, every calculated expansion of his network, came with an undercurrent of unease. He sensed the invisible threads weaving across the city, connecting people he trusted with forces he did not yet understand. It was a web larger than he had ever imagined, and while it offered him power, it also offered exposure, an exposure he could not fully measure. The discipline that had guided him thus far was now a fragile barrier against the inevitable entropy of success. He walked through his neighborhoods and noticed the change in the air. The streets that had once felt familiar now carried traces of caution. Eyes lingered longer, conversations fell silent when he approached, and a subtle tension threaded through spaces that had once been ordinary. The city had begun to recognize him not just as a person, but as an idea, a center of gravity that pulled attention, ambition, and sometimes greed toward him. And with that recognition came responsibility he had never asked for. A responsibility that had already begun to exceed his own control. In these moments of observation, Rick became increasingly aware of the cost of influence. Trust, once freely given, now had to be negotiated in gestures, in tone, in the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. People's needs and desires began to intersect with his, and the boundaries of personal connection grew thin. Every smile could conceal expectation. Every nod could carry an obligation. Every meeting, no matter how casual, felt laden with consequence. He felt the bittersweet weight of accomplishment. He had built something remarkable, not with spectacle, not with intimidation, but with strategy, calmness, and discipline. Yet the very structures that gave him strength were now capable of exerting pressure back upon him. He could feel the subtle erosion of autonomy, the quiet realization that his empire, for all its order, was beginning to take on a life of its own. The lines between mastery and surrender were imperceptibly thin. One evening, the realization crystallized. Rick was at a house party, the kind that had once been casual gatherings of friends and confidants. Music throbbed in the background, a rhythmic pulse that contrasted with the quieter hum of tension weaving through the rooms. People moved around him with polite attention, some laughing, some speaking in softer voices than necessary, some pausing mid-conversation when he entered a doorway. And he noticed, for the first time with clarity, that he no longer belonged in the same way he had before. He belonged, yes, but not entirely to himself. The moment struck quietly like a brush of wind across the skin. He excused himself from the center of the crowd, walking toward the dim glow of the backyard. The sounds of laughter, conversation, and music followed him, distant now, filtered through a wall of space and reflection. He stepped onto the porch and let the cool night air wash over him, carrying the sense of warm asphalt, nearby trees, and the faint smoke from someone's forgotten cigarette dot in the distance. He heard the echo of celebration, a faint ripple of life that seemed both familiar and alien. And he realized fully and without exaggeration that the empire he had built with meticulous care and discipline no longer belonged solely to him. It was a living force moving through the city, influencing people and events in ways that could not be entirely foreseen or controlled. It existed beyond his immediate grasp, entwined with ambition, expectation, and the inexorable drift of influence. Rick stood there for a long while, observing the night and the quiet stirrings of a city that had begun to change around him. He felt the duality of his existence, the grounded boy from South Central and the myth that whispered across streets and alleyways alike. Both were real, both were necessary, and both were pulling at him in ways he could no longer ignore. The lines were blurring, and he understood, with a clarity born of years observing human behavior, that once the lines blur, the world begins to move in directions no single person can fully steer. Ambition had delivered him to a rarefied space, yes, but with it had come a quiet, inexorable tension that would follow him as surely as the night followed day. And in that moment, standing alone under the vast expanse of the Los Angeles sky, Rick knew that he was no longer simply building an empire. He was entering its orbit, bound to forces that were already larger than he had imagined, and learning for the first time how little control one truly possesses over the world one has created. Fame arrived for Rick Ross quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though it had been waiting at the edge of his world for years and only now chose to step forward. It did not announce itself with lights or headlines. It did not knock at his door or demand recognition. Instead, it began to shape the spaces he inhabited, bending reality around him, altering the air, and creating reflections of a life he barely recognized. The streets whispered his name. Faces turned toward him, some with admiration, some with curiosity, some with subtle calculation. The myth of Freeway Rick had taken on a life of its own, leaving the man who had built it in quiet shadow, observing, careful, detached. The city responded as if rehearsed. Glamorous rooms filled with laughter, yet the sound seemed suspended, floating slightly above him rather than around him. Soft light glimmered across polished surfaces, casting elongated silhouettes that danced slowly against walls. Rick remained at the edge of these scenes, silent, unnoticed. Voices drifted through hallways, conversations brimming with excitement or tension, and he observed from the periphery as though he were both present and absent. Each reflection, the wealth, the influence, the respect felt simultaneously intoxicating and alien. Creating a dissonance he could neither fully embrace nor reject, he began to recognize the cost of being seen. Silence became a shield, a protective layer that allowed him to navigate the rooms and streets without drawing unnecessary attention. Caution became a constant companion, guiding every movement, every word, every glance. But with each measured choice came loneliness, subtle and pervasive. Even in crowds, he felt the quiet pressure of observation, the gentle weight of expectation pressing against him from every angle. Rick noticed the distortions first in small, almost imperceptible ways. Unmarked cars lingered longer than they should have. Shadows appeared where none had been before. Faces repeated themselves in places he had walked countless times, yet now seemed unfamiliar. The air itself shifted, charged with something he could not yet name, a tension both faint and undeniable, a foreshadowing of forces that were slowly closing in. He sensed them more than he saw them, felt them in the prickling of his skin. The brief hesitation in a passerby's gaze, the almost imperceptible shift of energy in rooms he had once known as familiar. And yet, he could not deny the allure of the reflections. The myth offered him power, influence, and opportunity. Doors that had been closed in his youth now opened, not with struggle, but with recognition. People responded differently to him, unconsciously bending their actions to accommodate the story they had heard. It was a strange duality. The man remained grounded, disciplined, precise. Yet the myth of Freeway Rick began to act independently, moving through the city, shaping perception, and drawing attention he could neither summon nor control. He found himself navigating this mirrored world with a growing awareness that the reflections he saw were not simple reproductions of reality. The glamour carried an edge of unreality, a subtle distortion that made every success feel both earned and borrowed, every compliment shadowed by an unspoken question. Was he truly in control, or had he become a participant in a story already being written without his consent? Each mirror he encountered seemed to answer in a different way. The streets whispered one version, the rooms another. The people he trusted offered glimpses that were never complete. And the longer he existed in this environment, the more the lines between reality and reflection blurred. Even within the familiar rhythms of his own routines, the distortions persisted. The offices, the warehouses, the quiet corners where decisions were made, each space now carried echoes of observation, as if the very walls had begun to note his movements and choices. Rick began to recognize the subtle pressures of expectation. Employees looked to him for guidance not only in operations, but in perception, adjusting their actions to preserve the narrative of his influence. Friends greeted him with a mixture of warmth and careful calculation, each gesture weighed and measured. And the streets themselves responded with a cautious respect that bordered on reverence. Yet he moved deliberately, quietly, preserving the discipline that had carried him this far. Every choice was measured. Every engagement was intentional. He did not flaunt, did not boast, did not seek the gaze of strangers. He allowed the myth to grow, observing it as one might observe a river carving a canyon, an unstoppable force shaping the world without asking permission. But even as he watched, he sensed that the current had begun to move beyond him, that the waters he had guided now had momentum of their own. The city's nights reflected his duality. He would sit in rooms filled with laughter, music, and celebration, yet feel the quiet presence of tension threading through every gesture. Shadows seemed to move independently, elongating with intent. Faces were familiar yet subtly altered. Conversations continued, but the energy behind them carried an extra weight, a layer of anticipation and caution. He understood with a clarity born of years of observation that influence had a cost, and that the myth he had allowed to grow had already begun to outpace the man himself. One evening, alone in a quiet room, he approached a darkened window and caught his reflection. The city outside sprawled beneath him, a network of streets, lights, and distant hums of movement. Music drifted faintly from a nearby house, the bass a gentle pulse that reminded him of human life continuing around him. And in that reflection, he saw both himself and something larger, a projection, an idea, a myth that had been shaped by the world, not entirely by him. It was mesmerizing and unnerving in equal measure. A mirror in which power and vulnerability coexisted. Rick traced the contours of his own reflection, noticing the shadows beneath his eyes, the subtle tension in his posture, the quiet alertness in his gaze. The man beneath the myth was still present, disciplined and observant. Yet the myth itself had taken on a momentum he could feel, a force that moved independently, influencing perception, shaping behavior, and bending reality in ways that were both exhilarating and disquieting. It was a reminder that legends are rarely contained, that influence is never static, and that the world he had built could no longer be managed in the way he once imagined. And as he stood there, the music faint behind him and the city's pulse echoing in the distance, Rick understood a truth that had always lurked beneath his careful construction. The myth of Freeway Rick had grown beyond him, and the reflections he now navigated were no longer simply mirrors. They were their own reality, moving independently, shaping lives, and tracing a path that he could observe, but could no longer fully direct or restrain. Change does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrives as a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle tightening of space, a pressure that moves imperceptibly but consistently. For Rick Ross, the first signs of a new era in his life did not come with sirens or flashing lights. They came with stillness, quiet, methodical, almost clinical in its inevitability. Somewhere beyond the glow of street lamps and the rhythm of freeway traffic, the net was beginning to form, drawn slowly around him by forces he could sense, but not yet fully see. Law enforcement did not announce their presence with intrusion. Instead, it manifested in dimly lit rooms, the soft flipping of file pages, the deliberate tapping of keyboards, and the low murmur of voices that carried authority without volume. Investigators moved with patience, tracing lines through spreadsheets and notes, linking one observation to another. Telephone numbers, addresses, innocuous conversations, they were all threads being pulled gently into a web. The world outside continued its restless hum, unaware that these threads were converging, and that the quiet attention of faceless agents was slowly knitting patterns that would define futures, unmarked. Cars waited under streetlights, engines idling softly as the night stretched on. Inside, officers whispered while reviewing photographs, listening to recordings, and consulting stacks of documents with calm precision. Each motion was deliberate, each observation intentional. Surveillance unfolded like a slow symphony, methodical and unhurried, a quiet anticipation building beneath the surface of the city. The work was invisible, almost elegant in its detachment, but it carried an undeniable weight, a force that was gradually constricting the spaces Rick had once navigated freely. Rick felt it, though he could not see it in full. The city around him remained unchanged in its surface rhythms, the hum of freeways, the glow of neon signs, the flicker of lights in apartment windows, but he sensed the shift in a more subtle register. Decisions became more deliberate, movements more precise, silences stretched longer. He moved with care, aware that the margin for error was narrowing, that each choice carried more consequence than it had only weeks before. His intuition, honed through years of observation, whispered that the world he had shaped was approaching its inevitable turn. Even in familiar neighborhoods, he noticed subtle differences. Shadows seemed deeper, streets quieter than they had any right to be. Unfamiliar faces lingered at corners, watching with a neutrality that felt heavy with potential. Vehicles that had once been anonymous now seemed to hover with intention. The city's pulse had not changed. Only his perception had shifted, revealing patterns that had always been present but unnoticed. The net was tightening, not suddenly, but inexorably, with the patience of something that had anticipated him long before he anticipated it. Inside his own buildings, the atmosphere reflected the external tension. Conversations that once carried levity were now measured, cautious, punctuated by pauses that hinted at uncertainty. The people he trusted operated with a heightened awareness, an unspoken recognition that the stakes had increased. Rick's eyes missed nothing, yet he allowed no outward sign of concern. Every gesture was controlled, every word weighed, every step calibrated. He had learned that movement could betray intention, that inaction could be just as telling as a misstep. The discipline that had elevated him now served as a shield, a buffer against the unseen pressure encroaching on all sides. He observed the agent's methods with a detached curiosity, as though watching a distant machine at work. They did not move hastily. They did not shout. There were no dramatic confrontations, only the accumulation of meticulous observations, audio tapes recorded without emotion, photographs cataloged without commentary, notes filed with exacting care. The beauty of it, if beauty could exist in this context, was in the precision. Every pattern discerned, every anomaly noted, every detail stitched into a larger map that would in time define him and the empire he had built. Rick's reflection on these movements was internal, private. He did not overreact, did not panic, but he recognized the rhythm, the inevitability, and the scale. He understood that influence carries attention, that networks generate exposure, and that even the most disciplined operations are visible to eyes trained in quiet observation. The awareness brought with it a mixture of respect, anticipation, and unease and emotional tension that was unspoken yet palpable. The night became his confidant, walking alone beneath the faint glow of streetlights, the wind moving gently through the air. He could feel the pulse of traffic beneath him, a distant hum that echoed the quiet accumulation of forces converging on his life. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light became a note in an intricate symphony of consequence. He sensed the patterns forming without needing confirmation, felt the edges of a world slowly pressing inward. And he knew, without being told, that the era he had shaped through patience, discipline, and careful strategy was approaching its inevitable turn. Even as the net drew closer, Rick retained his calm. The power he had cultivated, the network he had built, and the influence he wielded did not vanish in the face of encroaching observation. If anything, the awareness sharpened his instincts, heightening his attention to the subtle cues that might have gone unnoticed in earlier days. Silence, once a convenience, became a necessity. Observation, once a tool, became a survival mechanism. Every decision carried weight, every movement potential consequence. And yet he continued, composed, disciplined. Aware of the invisible architecture forming around him, he paused on a quiet street corner, the wind brushing against his face, carrying the faint sense of asphalt, distant cooking fires, and the lingering heat of day. Cars moved along the freeway, a rhythmic pulse beneath the city's skin. Above him, the stars were dimmed by the haze of urban glow, a faint reminder of constancy in a world increasingly governed by human design and meticulous observation. Rick understood that the forces converging around him were patient, thorough, and inevitable. The world had noticed him. It had cataloged him. And in time, it would respond. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a private acknowledgement of uncertainty. Not fear, not panic, but recognition. The patterns he had spent a lifetime observing were now forming against him in ways he could anticipate, but not fully control. The net was tightening, not in dramatic bursts, but in the quiet, relentless manner of inevitability. It was a measure of the precision with which the world now turned its attention toward him and the empire he had built. And he, disciplined, watchful, prepared, accepted it as part of the unfolding story. Standing beneath the soft hum of the city, Rick felt the night wrap around him like a blanket, both protective and constrictive. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of tires on asphalt, the faint echo of voices, the subtle reminder that the world continued its rhythms with or without his consent. He breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the quiet settle over him, knowing that the era he had influenced, shaped, and dominated was now on the brink of transformation. The stillness of the night, the hum of traffic, the weight of unseen attention all confirmed what he had intuited. The world was moving toward a turn he could sense, could prepare for, but could not yet fully define. And in that stillness, Rick understood with clarity that everything he had built, every street he had traversed, every alliance he had forged, every quiet observation he had made was now intersecting with forces beyond his immediate control. The net had formed, and the era he had shaped was approaching the inevitable moment of reckoning. The collapse of an empire is rarely announced with fanfare. There are no explosions, no roaring crowds, no cinematic finales. In Rick Ross's world, the fall arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though fate itself preferred to speak in whispers. The air carried the same hum of freeways, the same distant pulse of life across south-central Los Angeles. The city did not pause for him, did not shift to mark the moment. It moved on, indifferent, while the threads of a meticulously constructed life began to unravel in silence. The first signs were subtle: a knock at the door, the soft shuffle of shoes on pavement, the measured rhythm of footsteps approaching. There was no shouting, no dramatics, only the slow certainty of inevitability. Officers entered with calm precision, their movements deliberate and unhurried. They carried themselves with solemnity, a quiet authority that needed no display. Doors opened softly, papers rustled, pens scratched on forms, and each gesture carried weight. A rhythm marking the passage of events that could not be reversed. Rick observed it all with the same composure that had defined his rise. He did not panic. He did not resist. He had built his life on observation, on discipline, on understanding the nuances of human behavior. Now he watched the processes of law enforcement unfold like a choreography he could anticipate, though not prevent. Each step was measured, deliberate, and in its own quiet way, elegant. Arrests, in this context, were not acts of violence. They were inevitable punctuation marks. Almost poetic in their stillness, he moved with the awareness of someone who has long understood the fragility of control. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle acknowledgement carried meaning, yet he remained internal, composed, reflective. His mind traced back through years of decisions, alliances, and calculated risks. The streets, the warehouses, the neighborhoods, the people, everything he had shaped, nurtured, and protected now existed outside his command. And still, he accepted it with a quiet dignity, as if recognizing the natural cadence of life and consequence. The interrogation room became a theater of reflection. He sat alone, the walls bare and unadorned, their neutrality amplifying the weight of thought. The fluorescent light above cast a muted glow, neither flattering nor hostile, illuminating the contours of a face shaped by years of strategy, patience, and observation. He traced the distance between who he had been, the boy who navigated South Central with cautious ambition, and who he had become, the myth. The operator, the man whose name had carried influence across neighborhoods, buildings, and city blocks. The measurement was not bitter. It was contemplative, almost tender, a quiet reconciliation of identity and consequence. Outside, the city continued its rhythms, unaffected by the internal shifts occurring within these four walls. Freeways pulsed with cars, distant music floated from open windows. Neighbors moved through streets oblivious to the turning of this chapter in his life. The contrast between the persistence of the city and the dissolution of his empire created a subtle tension, one that Rick observed without judgment. He understood, as he had understood so many other things, that the world does not pause for individual consequence. It continues, patient and indifferent, while lives intersect and diverge in ways that may seem monumental to those involved, but ephemeral to the broader rhythm of existence. The officers moved around him with calm efficiency, guiding him through spaces he had once traversed freely. Every step was deliberate, each movement marked with the solemnity of inevitability. Rick did not speak unnecessarily. Words in this moment were superfluous. Silence carried the weight of reflection, and he let it envelop him, a buffer against the finality he was only beginning to fully acknowledge. There was a dignity in stillness, and he embraced it with the same precision he had applied to every other facet of his life. He recalled the empire he had built, tracing its architecture in his mind, the networks of trusted associates, the careful systems of distribution, the quiet discipline that had allowed him to move through the city with subtle authority. Each element was now suspended in time, frozen by the inevitability of law and consequence. Yet, in its suspension, he recognized the artistry of it, the coherence, the meticulous attention to detail, the silent order that had once been his greatest achievement. And though it would dissolve behind him, the memory of its construction remained intact. A quiet testament to the life he had led. The streets, the neighborhoods, and the city itself became a backdrop, indifferent and constant. Rick was led through doors, past corners, and down halls that had once been part of his domain. Every step echoed softly against walls, a rhythmic punctuation to the narrative of inevitability. His gaze, steady and calm, absorbed the shifting textures of light and shadow, the faint movements of those tasked with escorting him, and the quiet hum of life continuing around him. It was a delicate dance, measured and precise, and he participated fully, aware of the contrast between motion and meaning. Even in movement, his mind remained reflective. He considered the juxtaposition of past and present, the innocence of his early ambitions, the quiet discipline of his ascent, the careful orchestration of an empire, and now the slow disintegration of it all. Yet he did not dwell in regret. Instead, he acknowledged each chapter with clarity and grace. Life had unfolded as it would, shaped by choices, circumstances, and inevitability. The quiet dignity of acceptance replaced any need for defiance, and reflection replaced the instinct for denial. And so, as he was guided through corridors and into the awaiting vehicles, Rick allowed himself a final observation of the world he had influenced. Freeways pulsed beneath him, neighborhoods carried on with their lives, and the empire, once expansive and intricate, began to dissolve quietly behind him. The fall was not violent. It was not dramatic. It was inevitable, measured, and quiet, as all true reckonings often are, in the soft hum of tires on asphalt, the distant murmur of voices, and the gentle pulse of the city continuing its indifferent rhythm. Rick understood the poetry of the moment. His life had shifted from dominance to reflection, from command to acceptance. And though the future was uncertain, the clarity of understanding brought its own calm. The empire had fallen, but the man remained a witness to the unfolding world, composed, observant, and reconciled to the inevitability of consequence. Time behaves differently when the world contracts to the dimensions of a cell. The streets no longer hum beneath your feet. The neon glow of freeways no longer sketches patterns against the night, and the laughter of friends and allies fades into memory. For Rick Ross, imprisonment was not a violent rupture. It was not a punctuated fall or a sudden end. It was a long, slow contraction of space and expectation, a stretching of minutes into hours, hours into days, where every action was deliberate and every silence unbroken. Time itself became a teacher, patient and unrelenting, guiding him through a landscape both internal and external. The corridors of the facility echoed with a measured rhythm. Footsteps tapped along the linoleum floors, creating a subtle percussion that marked the passage of days. Doors clicked softly behind guards, their monotone routine blending into the larger hum of institutional life. Rick observed these rhythms with a quiet attentiveness, noting the way shadows shifted with the fluorescent lighting, the faint scent of cleaning fluids lingering in corners, the occasional distant laughter or argument carried across the hallways. Each detail was a reminder of the continuity of the world, even in a space designed to feel isolating and immutable. Mornings arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly. Letters folded neatly on his small desk waited for him in the pale wash of sunlight that slanted through high windows. Each envelope carried fragments of life outside, words from friends, family, distant acquaintances, reminders of connections that persisted despite physical separation. He opened them methodically, savoring the weight of each line, the rhythm of each sentence, the resonance of voices not heard aloud but felt through paper. Time here was measured in small acts of observation, in the deliberate unfolding of days that could otherwise feel indistinguishable from one another. The soundscape of his world was muted yet alive. From behind walls, televisions murmured distant voices and images, fragmented and softened, a backdrop to the stillness. The occasional clang of a gate, the shuffle of feet along hallways, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, all became part of a texture that Rick began to recognize as subtle teaching. In the absence of distraction, every sensory cue gained clarity. Every repetition, every pattern, every minute gesture became a lesson in patience, in attention, and in understanding the rhythms of life as they unfolded beyond the immediate confines of ambition and empire. His thoughts wandered slowly, following paths that could not have existed in the rush of the streets. Memories rose like faint smoke, the quiet moments of his youth, the discipline that had guided him through early struggles, the careful building of networks and influence, the faces of friends and associates now distant, altered, or absent. He traced back through choices made with ambition, guided by circumstance, and learned to examine them without anger or regret. The contemplative lens of confinement allowed him to separate intention from outcome, action from consequence, self from myth. Regret existed in soft, almost imperceptible shades. He did not dwell in bitterness. The mistakes he had made, the misjudgments, the moments of overreach, the subtle erosions of trust were acknowledged with clarity, not accusation. Each memory was examined, its edges traced, its implications considered. In this quiet examination, Rick found understanding, not absolution, not surrender, but comprehension. He began to recognize the duality of his existence, the boy shaped by South Central, limited by circumstance yet disciplined in ambition, and the man who had become a myth, carrying influence and expectation far beyond what a single life could sustain. Time in this compressed, deliberate environment revealed the weight of both. He considered the nature of consequence itself, how choices ripple outward, touching lives both close and distant, shaping landscapes unseen and often unimagined. He traced the architecture of his decisions, noting where discipline had guided him and where ambition had obscured judgment. The observation was quiet, almost meditative. The past became a teacher, revealing patterns he had once acted upon instinctively, now illuminated by reflection and distance. Every success, every error, every pivot in his life took on new meaning when examined in the slow light of isolation. Even small acts gained significance. The folding of sheets, the careful arrangement of personal space, the ritual of meals taken with deliberate attention, all became points of awareness, moments to anchor himself in the present. Time, stretched and unhurried, allowed for observation, for study, for learning that extended beyond the tactical to the emotional and psychological. He became acutely aware of the nuances of patience, of restraint, of the delicate balance between action and observation. Each day, though structurally simple, carried a wealth of subtle lessons if met with attention. He reflected on the nature of identity. Who was he now, beneath the myth, beneath the reputation? beneath the streets that once carried his name. In solitude, Rick traced the contours of himself with care. The man who had risen, disciplined, cautious, patient, who had built structures and networks and influence, now faced the quiet measure of self. He considered ambition, pride, and desire alongside humility, introspection, and the consequences of living within both. The observation was not painful. It was not frenetic. It was calm, deliberate, a gentle reconciliation of self with world. And in this patient stillness, a rare clarity emerged. Rick sat in a small patch of sunlight that slanted through a narrow window, dust motes drifting slowly in the warm glow. Eyes closed, he inhaled and exhaled with deliberate care, letting the rhythm of breath mirror the rhythm of days. For the first time in a long while, the world felt suspended, not chaotic, not oppressive, but quiet and instructive. The past, the empire, the myth, and the self all converged in that simple, luminous moment. He felt something he had not encountered in years, a near tangible sense of understanding, a calm comprehension of consequence, circumstance, and the subtle patterns of life he had once observed only in motion. In that sunlight, with eyes closed, the lessons of time, its patience, its clarity, its quiet insistence were palpable. Rick felt the slow expansion of awareness, the weight of choices tempered by observation, the gentle acknowledgement of self within the ebb and flow of life. The distant sounds of the world continued outside. Footsteps in hallways, the muffled hum of voices, the soft clatter of metal and keys. And within that containment, he discovered a freedom of understanding, a reflective space in which the mind could trace paths long ignored, measure distances long forgotten, and reconcile the layers of identity he had carried for decades. And so, in the small patch of sunlight, Rick sat, breathing slowly, aware of both the weight of the past and the quiet promise of reflection. Time had become a teacher, patient and precise, and he had learned to observe, to measure, and to understand, not with urgency, not with anger, but with clarity. In that simple stillness, he discovered a rare, almost tender peace, and the slow unfolding of self amidst the silence of consequence. Time moves differently once the world no longer contains you. The streets of Los Angeles continue to hum beneath the endless arc of freeway lights. Yet those who once moved in tandem with your presence now carry fragments of memory, whispers of influence, echoes that linger long after footsteps have faded. For Rick Ross, the final chapter of his story is not a tale of sensationalism or headline-grabbing triumphs. It is a meditation on resonance, how a name travels, not through headlines or photographs alone, but through the subtle, persistent pulse of collective memory. The city itself has changed, as cities always do. Neighborhoods that once bore his influence have shifted in tone, appearance, and rhythm. Buildings have been repurposed, streets widened, palm trees planted or removed, corners that once marked his presence now silent, indistinguishable from countless others. Yet in these transformations, a quiet trace remains. Music carries his name through lyrics, conversations recall his choices, and the stories told by those who lived through his era continue to circle in hushed tones. The echo is not loud, not demanding, but persistent. It lingers like a shadow at the edge of light, shaping perception without requiring presence. Rick observes these reflections not with pride, nor with regret, but with quiet understanding. Legacy is not always visible. It is not a monument or a photograph. It is the subtle way a memory informs thought, the way a story circulates, the way the resonance of past choices continues to influence the present. He traces the rhythm of this echo through cultural touchstone songs, interviews, conversations, even casual recollections in neighborhoods he once knew intimately. Each utterance of his name carries an energy both removed and potent, a reminder of the life that once intersected with so many others. Old photographs and faded prints capture fragments of time. In one, A young man with quiet eyes stands under the flicker of freeway lights. In another, a room heavy with shadows hints at strategy and silent observation. Rick traces each image with a hand that no longer trembles, noting the distance between then and now. These images do not glorify. They do not vilify. They are markers of presence, silent witnesses to a life lived under pressures, ambition, and consequence. Each photograph, each frame, is a reminder that existence is not measured by spectacle alone, but by the subtle persistence of memory. Dim street corners, those once active with whispered transactions and careful observation, now host unfamiliar faces moving with routines unconnected to his influence. Yet the air retains a faint sense of history, a residue of choices, actions, and consequences that shape the rhythms of place. Rick moves through these recollections as though walking in slow motion, noting the evolution of space and the persistence of echoes. The city carries forward, indifferent yet attentive in ways that only those who observe deeply can perceive. The streets, though altered, remain repositories of memory, their contours shaped as much by past presence as by current reality. At the emotional core of the story lies reflection on the life that has passed. Ambition, once a driving current, is now understood as a force that shaped both opportunity and consequence. Brotherly alliances, formed and tested in the crucible of circumstance, are remembered for their quiet complexity rather than dramatic resolution. Fear and survival, woven into the rhythm of daily life, are recognized as formative, instructive elements rather than sources of shame. Transformation, both internal and external, is acknowledged with the subtlety of acceptance. These threads, running through decades, create a tapestry not of legend but of lived experience. Rick senses that his story, his choices, his triumphs, his missteps has found a place in the consciousness of the city. He recognizes the weight and inevitability of consequence in each reflection, yet he does not seek to claim ownership over the echo. Memory, like water, flows freely. It shapes the contours of those who receive it, yet it is not restrained by intention. The myth, the narrative, the whispers of Freeway Rick now travel independently, existing in conversation, in culture, and in the subtle memory of those who lived through its influence. The echo is gentle, persistent, and detached from the man himself. Time slows further, moving as though measured by reflection rather than seconds. Rick finds himself tracing the contours of experience in quiet, deliberate moments. He walks streets once familiar, now altered, letting the rhythm of movement match the cadence of thought. He observes the city's pulse, noting the persistence of life, the hum of freeways, the distant laughter, the occasional whisper of memory. Each observation reinforces a central truth. The world moves forward, carrying echoes without conscious intention, shaping perception in ways subtle, persistent, and inevitable. The final reflection comes in a moment of stillness. Rain begins to fall softly over Los Angeles, gentle drops pattering on asphalt and leaves, washing the city with quiet rhythm. The sound is measured, consistent, soothing, yet carries the weight of continuity. Rick stands beneath the gentle cascade, listening to the rhythm, sensing the resonance of his name carried not by headlines, notoriety, or myth, but by memory itself, a quiet echo drifting through time. The city absorbs it without pause, and in that absorption, the story reaches its natural conclusion, a recognition that life, influence, and legacy exist as much in perception as in action. In this moment, Rick feels a sense of equilibrium. Not triumph, not regret, just the calm awareness of existence shaped by choice, circumstance, and consequence. The rain cleanses not in literal terms, but metaphorically, allowing reflection without burden. The echoes of influence continue to move through the city, threading through conversation, memory, and story, yet they do not demand acknowledgement. They exist quietly, persistently, and gently. as all true echoes do. As the rain falls and the city continues its pulse, freeways humming, streetlights shimmering in reflections, distant voices carried faintly on the wind, Rick steps back from observation into reflection. He is neither celebrated nor condemned by these echoes. He is simply present and understanding. Time has carried lessons, distance has offered perspective, and memory has preserved resonance. In the quiet harmony of rainfall and residual hums of the city, the narrative of his life settles into completion. The chapters, once marked by ambition, consequence, and transformation, now reside in subtle resonance, persistent but serene. And so, the name Freeway Rick travels onward, not as spectacle, not as headline, not as legend, but as a quiet echo. It passes through conversations, threads its way into music, settles into memory. The city carries it with measured neutrality, and those who encounter it are shaped in imperceptible ways. The life choices and reflections of one man are distilled into a persistence that neither demands attention nor seeks it. It simply exists, drifting through time, gentle, unhurried, and eternal in its quiet resonance. The story concludes, as all stories must, not with drama, but with a calm acknowledgement that presence, influence, and memory endure, even as the world continues its ceaseless rhythm.